time we are going to talk about assessment of culture and personality. Last time I talked about lots of different traits and lots of ways that cultures differ. I emphasized that just to not oversimplify, to make sure that you don't kind of just hand wave your way through and assume that, everyone from one country has the same culture, as I kind of talked about my own experiences. That's also why my big fat Greek wedding, only the first one, all the other ones are dead to me, is a thing, because it really spoke to me. Still not a sponsor. But yeah, so let's keep going. So, Trianides, whose name I think I am pronouncing correctly, this had 3 dimensions that can be applied to individuals. So, and these kind of map on nicely. And so, because assessing a culture is pretty similar to assessing a person. That's the idea. So, we've already talked a little about cultural complexity. This maps on pretty nicely to cognitive complexity. Now, cultural tightness maps on pretty well to conscientiousness, as well as an intolerance for ambiguity. And lastly, collectivist versus individualistic maps on pretty well to alliocentrism and idiocentrism. I frankly just use the shorthand, not ham, when I talk about, I essentially, whenever I say collectivist, I really mean allocentrism, but I'm too lazy to use it and explain it, because it's the same thing, pretty close. So, idiocentrism versus allocentrism is like its own construct on a continuum. It's a dimension of personal values that focuses on one whether believes the group is more important than the individual, or vice versa. So, alliocentrism is group. So, one trick I have is all. So, allocentrism versus idiocentrism, individual, or I. That's how I do it. You would think that I would be able to do it more easily, but nope, that's how I have to do it. Okay, so what we can do is look at this. So how do we compare across cultures? Well, what we can do is look at the same traits across cultures. So we can look at the MMPI, the Big 5, as well as self-esteem, and see how those differ. As well as compare subcultures. So you don't want to just get the average of the country and be like, yeah, that's it. And so when we crawl in, we may find, and you can compare effects across countries. That's often kind of the straightforward way to do this. We also find that like the same outcomes may be associated with different traits across countries. So you want to look both across country and within country. And last time I talked about, so way back when we looked at the United States map, we saw that there were clusters of, like, openness, for example, was very prominent in Colorado, which I still think is hilarious. And so we can also do this at a country level. So all these different colors here highlight what the average level is. So Turkey, Norway, the Viking lands here had a pretty high level. So it goes from green to middle of the road orange, down to blue, and so there are average level differences of traits across cultures. Now, obviously, there are some problems here when we're comparing across languages, sampling availability, like who fills out these surveys. There's a lot of challenges with doing research like this, and so you can't just be like, oh, look, average levels. Everybody in those countries is different, because no. It's the same with, like, average levels of, like, spatial reasoning by genders. We talked about how there is a gender difference, but that doesn't mean that, like, every single male has a third of a standard deviation above every single woman. No. There are very clear overlapping bell curve. I'm going to draw this so we can be horrified. Alright. So, it's not like okay, so we got ladies. And so here is not what it is. Alright, So, and dudes. So it's not like there is zero overlap at all. Instead, what we have is, okay, I'm gonna illustrate this again. Alright, so, no! There we go, pen. Alright, so here and I'm using spatial reasoning just because it's an easy groupy one to do. Okay, so we have ladies here, and the average, so this is like 1/3. Okay, 1/3. Alright. And honestly, like, the distributions are, there's a lot of overlap, and it's probably more, okay, no, let's try this again. You can see why so, I mean, you can also have the overlap be like, pretty much like this. My drawing is awful. In all likelihood, you will not see. Okay, so here we go. So here's the third of a standard deviation. You've got a ton of people in this lower group that are above the folks in the higher group. So there's a lot of variability. So just because there's an average level difference doesn't mean that people can't be super talented in the lower group. I will most likely Photoshop a better picture because this looks like garbage. Okay. But my point is that averages are not end all be all. People still differ. Okay. So question is different traits in different cultures. So are the meanings the same? So beyond just don't overread into average level differences, there are variants. So the big five, so we can find it in all five, in 50 plus cultures, but there's also variability. So for example, when we translate the big five into Spanish, we miss a big chunk of Spanish personality, where there are other traits that come up, like humor, good nature, unconventionality. And so you can kind of smush them into openness, but not exactly. And so we miss those. Now, in general, here are the three that seem to be pretty universal. Conscientiousness seems to come up almost everywhere. Extroversion, so positive emotionality, also comes up pretty consistently, as well as agreeableness. These are the three. The other two, neuroticism and openness, less so. Sometimes they're split into two traits, other times they're smushed together, and there's still not universal agreement, but those three are considered the most universal. Now, in addition to this, we have different difficulties in translation. So when you do the lexical hypothesis as your start, that you get more differences than when you just translate the big five, which has been validated in the United States initially. That's where the big data sets came from. Eugene Springfield. Whoop, whoop. It's a famous data set that was great. But yeah. So you've got translational difficulties. My classic go-to is Schadenfreude, which is this taking pleasure in others' misfortunes. Now that we've stolen that word from the Germans, it comes up, but there's lots of words like that are missed. And in addition to that, we have patterns of responding that differ. It's called differential item functioning, and it can be a pain to be able to kind of translate because endorsements can vary. And so when somebody says a 5 out of 5 in one culture, that may not mean the same thing as a 5 out of 5 in another culture. It may be that a 4.5 in one culture is equivalent to a 5 in another. And when I say pain, it's very challenging to untangle those without some fancy statistical stuff that you can learn about in my psychological testing class. Cool. Okay, we're almost done, I promise. So, different traits, different cultures. We can go about this by creating endogenous scales. So, So essentially, to see if we go through the same process from the inside to see if the same traits emerge. So Big Five going from the beginning of lexical hypothesis to the end. So some Big Five traits do emerge when we use this approach, but not always. So some of the Big Five traits, extroversion tends to occur, conscientiousness tends to reoccur, and agreeableness, intellect and openness sometimes, neuroticism sometimes, and when we've done this with Chinese language, we find 7 factors for both China and Spain, but they're different factors. So China seems to have extroversion, conscientiousness, unselfishness, harmfulness. So this is kind of like the flip of agreeableness. Just like emotional stability and neuroticism kind of are the same thing, just flipped. Gentle temper and intellect, which maps onto openness. And lastly, stability, blah, blah, blah. Lastly, dependency/fragility. So that's 7. Now for Spain, we've got a different 7. So we've got positive valence, negative valence, conscientiousness, openness, agreeableness, pleasantness of emotion, null experience, and engagement/passion. So we get different factor structures out, and there are others that I've listed here. But that's the idea. So we can translate the Big Five, but is it really the universal? Okay, so here are my big questions. So to what degree do alright, so let's back up. Okay, so thinking. How does this apply? So if behavioral traits differ, does thinking differ too? Yes, it does. So to what degree do people from different cultures think differently? Spoilers, I just told you. They do. But how? So holistic thinking differs, and it seems to be more common in East Asian samples compared to American samples, that explaining events in context and seeking to integrate divergent points of view. So that's the holistic side versus kind of the more independent side, which is explaining events in isolation, and setting divergent points of view against each other. So East Asians seem to be more holistic than Americans. Surprise, surprise. But like this doesn't map on nicely to that collectivist versus individualistic, because the East Asian cultures include Japan and China, and Japan's much more individualistic than China. And kind of to illustrate, so both Japanese and Chinese samples are more willing than Americans to describe themselves in contradictory terms. Now, independent thinking is super, super controversial of an area. It's seen more in European Americans than Asian students. So the differences may be due to a culture of suppressing self-expression, and the ability to think and talk at the same time, which is allegedly more difficult for Asian than European Americans. But part of this, I think, might be language issue. I need more evidence to be convinced. As well as how the emphasis on importance is placed on learning about an area before attempting to formulate new ideas or ask questions, which is very important based on Confucian philosophy, way more important in Asian cultures. But okay, I'm going to leave this one as an exercise to the viewer to go kind of crawl in and think about all the problems with this area. Because not all the research, I'll leave this as an exercise for the reader. Okay, values. So, we're almost done, I promise. So, how can seemingly obvious and basic values vary across cultures? They do! The search for universal values is a thing. The idea is to look at the goals everyone wants to achieve. Now, we try to do, we as in psychology, so it's this idea that universal values are real, that go beyond cultural judgments, and I put real in quotes. So that's the implication for having this universal value system as opposed to relative values. So in theory, these are the ones that go beyond culture. They should be valued by everyone. Universal values. So here's how they're useful. Could be used to settle disputes between cultures. Now, this is not settled research by any means, but I'm going to show you a possible list of 10 on the next slide. Although it's not really a list. So, alright. So here seem to be the values that are relatively consistent. And you can see they range on openness to change versus conservatism. Here's one continuum. And here we've got self-transcendent versus self-enhancement. And so like power is kind of closer to self-enhancement and conservatism. So you can think about this like a grid. Personally, I would have preferred that they like made the dimensions like on the XY axis instead of this 45-degree nonsense, but that's just what it is. I might Photoshop a rotated version. We'll see if Mason editing later. Mason, edit this! Rotate it for me! We'll see if that happens. Sometimes she's very into editing, and other times she's like, I wanna go go grade. Sometimes other things take priority. So yeah, so here are the big 10 that are not, don't call them the big 10. So we've got power, achievement, hedonism, stimulation, self-direction, understanding, benevolence, tradition, conformity, security. These are the 10, and here they seem to differ on 2 dimensions. Openness to change versus conservatism, as well as self-transcendent versus self-enhancement. So that's the idea. Okay, so values. There are big cultural differences in values, so even in moral reasoning. So moral reasoning of like kind of the individualistic versus the collectivist culture, is a long-standing research interest. So kind of the trade-off between the rights of the individual versus the rights of the collective, liberty versus, so yeah, the rights of the individual versus the obligations, reciprocity, duties to the group. It all boils down to values, or like what you want to prioritize. So in general, values boil down to based on imposing independent or individualistic choice or group norm. So we see this in the debate on abortion, which I will touch on very briefly. I will not I'm just going to highlight how it's framed, just to give those of you on either end of this debate, here's how it can be thought of. So individualists this is not as cut and dry, because obviously we have there's a lot of independence on one side of this. So one potential way to see this is that individualists see the mother and her choice is more important, while collectivists see the baby as part of the group and something to be protected. That is the idea. I am not going to touch this debate with a 10-foot pole because I don't wanna. But this is how it can be framed. Okay, so next time we are going to talk about the origins of cultural differences. Woo! Cool. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, that's where we're going to go, and you'll have to watch the next video to find out. Bye-bye!